Pat, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the topic of change. Change is something that we can't avoid in life. You know, as we're growing up, we have to go through it, don't we? I mean, you're in a nice, settled home environment, and suddenly your parents say you got to go to the first grade or to kindergarten, and you have to make that adjustment. And then you get out of grade school, you have to make a new adjustment, make new friends, and in a new building for high school. And then many people have gone off to college with still greater difficulties and stresses involved. So we think of that personally. Then people get married and they are in a new kind of situation. We have to deal with aging, and we have to deal with the death of loved ones. So a change seems to be built into the life cycle, and I guess what happens very often that people experience it as being stressful, as bringing certain tensions, and that's what I want to try to deal with here.
I think I would agree with all that you say, Jim, that perhaps one of the earliest insights I had in my lifetime that I consider to be very philosophical was my association of the passing of time and change with the sound of a train and its very mournful whistle that I would listen to on summer nights while I was lying in bed, and think that my life is like this, that it's moving on, that it cannot be stopped and frozen. And in my sense at different times in my life that no matter how pleasant things are, I cannot freeze a moment and sort of nail it to a wall and hang with it for a while. And this in itself is very stressful, to recognize that life is all process and that we, our very best times are always slipping away even as we experience them.
Yeah, I know you mentioned the best times, and it's interesting that even those times are very often stressful as times of change, aren't they? I mean, people getting married, they have to move into a new kind of situation and relate in a different way, and often find that to be both exhilarating and joyful, but carrying its own tensions and stresses and crosses as well. Think of the birth of a new baby and what that brings into the family, or the entrance of a third youngster into the family, as the mothers often say. The one extra one seems to multiply the work so many times over. And so, again, even these joyful kinds of events that occur seem to bring a certain stress, tensions that people often find difficult to resolve.
I'd like to add to that the stress of taking on a new job. On the one hand, of course, people are always happy that they've been hired if they're between jobs or going into the workplace for the first time. But on the other hand, one steps into a situation in which one knows very little, has to be sort of walked through a series of processes, learn how things go, learn who is who. Learn the politics of the organization, if it is an organization of some sort, and there is that sense of helplessness, of not knowing quite what's expected, of how to respond, that makes a lot of demands of simply being unknown, and that sense of being somehow alien and estranged until one gets to know others and know the routine and feel that one fits in.
That's interesting way you say that, because I think part of the business of change that's hard is it breaks us out of our familiar patterns and routines, and those help to give us security. We know who we are. We don't have to think our way through them. We don't have to put a lot of psychic energy into managing them. They simply happen. We know how to get to work, and we know what to do when we get there, and the routines and tasks are somewhat the same, and therefore there's a familiarity about it that gives us a sense of security and helps us to know who we are and where we fit. And it's precisely that change breaks us out of and shatters a lot of the ordinary routines that's bound to create certain stresses. Just the familiarity of life, I think, helps us to cope with it in many ways.
We see this reflected in ourselves, I think, and in friends when we simply want to leave the house and go do something rather than stay home and continue reading the book or correcting papers or watching TV or baking cookies. That it's very difficult sometimes to dislodge people from their comfortable milieu and go out, perhaps have to put on clothes, drive a distance, and move into a situation where there isn't an assurance that they will be equally comfortable. For instance, going to a party where perhaps there are many persons that the other does not know or that we do not know. that somehow we hold back and often need nudging and prodding to make even that very minor and very temporary kind of change.
Yes, that's true, and that's often sort of embarrassing, isn't it?
Yes.
That such simple things can be hard to manage.
That's right.
I mean, it's always been striking to me when very mature people and who seem to be very with it will report great difficulties in doing small things in life or taking on any sort of stressful or changed situation. And but it's true for all of us. And I mean, there's no sense in trying to fool ourselves about it. It's simply part of the human condition. Don't you think we have times when we're more able to do that than others? I mean, sometimes it seems we sail through changes, we go through them easily. They're fine with us, and yet there's other times when we feel more fragile, maybe when we're more stretched because of other tensions and so on, that even the smallest change seems like it's going to be too much. This is the one I really can't handle.
That's
now.
right. That's right. And it's important for us to remember that both of these conditions, again, are in themselves subject to change, that at times little things seem to be momentous and overwhelming. And we know that. I know that through those times, rare of course, when I'm very thin-skinned and a small slight will kind of devastate me emotionally. And then at other times, I can laugh it off and come back and joke about it and really feel like I can take on the world. I can take on any challenge. I want to do something that's tough. I want to do something that demonstrates that I am this all-powerful person. And so both of those conditions, it seems to me, represent the two poles of our psyche. And we can be helped through both of them, I think, by recognizing that they too will change after a while.
Yes, you're really making it clear that change is part of life,
Yes.
isn't it? That it's built in. We are processive creatures, always on the move. The other thing, Pat, that causes the anxieties around change is the unknown future, not just simply leaving the routines, familiar patterns, but also the unknown future. And so many times that is scary in itself because we don't know if we'll measure up. We're not sure if we can handle it. We don't know precisely how we will be challenged and tested in this new situation. The future is essentially unknowable, and the change in life brings this on, so that even people who enter into marriages with great confidence, I think as many young people do, still have a twinge of this anxiety, like, can I really manage it? There's so many marriages that don't work, and will I be up to the task, and the unknown future here that awaits me. So you can see that. Jobs are the same way. Surely I think that happens a lot with death of loved ones, especially around holidays, important occasions. People are saying, well, how will I handle this loss? I mean, where do we go for the Thanksgiving dinner or to be together on Christmas? This new pattern, will it really assist me? Will it give me the security I need to cope with life? So if you think of any of the major kind of changes that occur in life, you can see the anxiety around the unknown character of what we're getting into.
And the importance of us recognizing and somehow coming to terms with what you're just suggesting, Jim, that the most important changes in our life probably, in fact, are not going to be initiated by ourselves. They will be represented perhaps in changes in our health or the health of others that we love, in the death of other persons, in perhaps they're changing in serious ways that alters a relationship we have with them that we didn't foresee and we didn't want, or changes in ourselves, maybe developments that in themselves are good, but that bring us to a point of recognizing that our connection with certain others in our lives no longer is strong, that we've moved in a direction someone we cared deeply for did not, and that there no longer is that binding union of values that once made us good friends.
Well, that's one of the sad changes, isn't it?
That's
that comes
right.
when you meet a friend you haven't seen for a while and you realize that you're in a different place than
That's
they
right.
are, that their values have changed or yours have, or your interests now are different, and you cannot talk easily with them anymore, and you know you're into a changed relationship. They're never going to be the intimate friend that they were once for you. And I think that's a great sadness connected with that.
Right.
The other thing I got out of what you said is that there's really two kinds of changes you could look at. One are those that are forced upon us, like the death of a loved one, or losing our jobs, becoming
Or
unemployed, losing health gradually, or getting older, simply dealing with the aging process, which is inevitable and something not willed usually by most people. So we could think along that line. But then there's the other changes that we initiate, people who decide to get married or decide to have a child, who decide to take on a different job. Now it's a different sort of thing, I believe, because you usually can see the second change that we've initiated in a more positive way. We've seen a plus value in making the change. Might be hard, but you got a lot of motivation going that's saying, well, I can do this. I decided to do it. I'm the one who initiated this. And deep down you feel it will be for the good, for you, your loved ones, your family, or whatever as you go along. So maybe that, I think
I like that distinction, Jim. The changes that are thrust upon us by circumstances we can't control, and then those that we enter upon willingly. And one of the interesting, probably one of the great challenges of life is making the decision to make a change or not make a change. I think of my father choosing to remain in a factory job because there was security when he had the opportunity to buy his own small business as an electrician. And he opted not to make the change, and I suspect that in the course of his life he probably wondered many times about whether or not that was the best decision. So whether to move in the direction of change or move in the direction of stasis, remaining where we are is another part of the stress of life, I guess. And I guess I'd like to suggest that perhaps we often see change as invariably for the better when perhaps it is not.
That's right. I mean, I think there is a notion in the culture that way, that each change will bring something better.
The new car, the new job, the new neighborhood,
Right.
new house, new
And then
wife, maybe.
That's right. New wife, that's right. New husband. I think that is true. And the harsh experience of life is that that's not always the case. I mean, you'd take the new job, which has greater responsibilities and brings in more income, but you find out that the added stress is something you don't want to deal with, and is more than you bargained for, in a sense. Maybe the new spouse doesn't work out much better than the previous spouse did. So that's always the case, I think, has to be brought into the whole mix of analyzing change. But Pat, I think what becomes important for all of us as we look at change is how do we cope with it better, and how can we manage it? And of course our scriptures help to give us some guidance along this line. I think that one of the persons that stands out in my mind along this line is the figure of Abraham, who's an important figure for the Jewish community, for Christians, and for Muslims as well. Abraham called the father of faith, and Abraham was living in a nice, settled environment. And he had it made, in a sense, and he receives the call to go forth to an unknown land. I mean, to move out from his structured, familiar life and to move into something he didn't understand, didn't know anything about. And he experienced that as a call from God. And he does this. He moves forward, and it brings him all kinds of strife and challenges and difficulties, but it also brings him a great fame as the father of a great nation, and gives him descendants beyond what he could have ever imagined. And so Abraham is the father of faith in part because he was willing and able to deal with very substantial changes in his life.
We, of course, talk about his being, directed by God, and we imagine and picture very often in the Scriptures God speaking in his own language to Abraham, so that what he was being asked to do was being asked very unequivocally, and that ordinarily isn't the way God speaks in our lives. And so a part of what I think we have to do, and it's more difficult than perhaps the clear-cut miraculous bidding of God, is to listen to the call within the heart, which often takes the form, I think, of a certain restlessness, a sense that perhaps I am in a rut. Perhaps my work is no longer calling the best from me. Perhaps this relationship is no longer good for me. And somehow trusting that God, that the Spirit is involved in that restlessness in the heart, trusting that. And in that trust, I think it becomes easier then to make a change that is needed, not to see this simply as a psychological neurosis, but to recognize that God operates within all of these various impulses and anxieties and yearnings in the heart.
Maybe the call to Abraham wasn't as clear as maybe the literary form
right.
of the Scriptures would suggest.
That's
You know,
right.
I mean, I think if you look at people like Joseph in the New Testament and other people who have been called by God, there is a complexity involved in it, and maybe it isn't always just that clear cut. And so I think that makes Abraham a more credible model of dealing with change myself. And I would think that as you read through the chapters in Genesis about Abraham, that maybe one gets that impression that he had to deal with ambiguity, with doubts, and so on, just like every other human being. And yet his greatness is found in his trusting. And I think there you brought up the right word, because I think that's what really counts. I mean, if you're going to deal with change and go into an unknown future, there has to be some sort of fundamental trust that it can be managed. And as I use that word fundamental trust, it makes me think of some of the psychological studies like people like Erik Erikson that say that this fundamental trust has to be at the basis of a healthy, mature life. And that is what sets the basis for being able to make these other changes that occur throughout the life cycle. But without that fundamental trust that life fundamentally is on your side, and we put it in religious terms that God is guiding the process, without that, it's just all too scary. It's all too frightening. That's why I would say if someone's having trouble dealing with change in their lives, maybe part of what one has to do is get back to the religious side of it, and to think through the faith dimension, and to maybe develop the prayer life again as a great aid in dealing with the unknown character that changes bring.
I would just like to add to that, and this is not directly related, but it's sort of a little digression, I suppose, that often we who are Christian will spend a great deal of time praying about possible changes that we think maybe we are being called to make, and we give sometimes different words to it. We say we are going to discern. That tends to be the word that's in vogue right now. Discern and prayerfully reflect on what we ought to be doing next year, whether we should make a particular change. And it's been helpful for me to realize that God is not going to allow her purposes to be thwarted by the choices that I make, that God's purposes can be fulfilled regardless, and that if there's choice A, B, and C, that in a sense all of them can be holy choices, and the kingdom can be furthered, and my own growth, my own spiritual growth, can be fostered in any of those choices. That it's not a case of if I miss the specific blueprint God intended for me, I'm damned.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Maybe by looking at the life of Jesus and the Gospels, we get a sense of that. It's like Jesus was one, in my mind, that when he dealt with people could always find the new step forward for them, could open a door for them, that no matter what other decisions you made, you weren't imprisoned in them. There was always the opportunity to make progress and to move in a new direction, to undergo a conversion experience. I think that is really crucial. I think it's important for mental health. I always say it this way, that there really isn't written on a blackboard somewhere up in the sky exactly what choices for change you need to make in your own life. Whatever we do, we believe there's a God who's with us in the process and will continue to guide us and will always give new opportunities. And what that does, I think, is take away some of the stress involved in the willed changes, the choices that you make. In other words, it's not always a matter of life and death. There's often choices that are fairly equally balanced, and any one of them could end up leading in constructive directions. So I believe that would be helpful to keep in mind. mind also. Pat has been talking here as a story from the Buddhist world. We're using religion to get perspective on change here. It's a story of two monks that are walking along, and the Buddhist monks were not to deal with women at all, not to be involved, or even to be looking at them or talking to them in public. And they're coming along, and here's a young maiden who wants help to get across the river. Well, the one monk, much to the chagrin of the other, picks her up, holds her in his arms, and carries her across the river and puts her on the other side. Well, the two monks walk along, and finally the first monk could contain himself no longer. He said, "You broke your vows. You've done this terrible thing. This is horrible. How could you do that? Carry that woman and touch this woman in public and all of this?" And the other monk looks at him and says, "Well, I'll tell you what," he said. "I did pick her up, that's right, carried her across. I set her down on the other side, and I left her there. But you have continued to carry her in your head." So, the point of the story in dealing with change...
What's that got to do with change,
It's got
Jim?
a lot to do with change,
okay.
because one of the essential things in dealing with change is to be able to let go. It's got a whole lot to do with attitude and perspectives. A letting go of what was familiar, letting go of the past, letting go of things that we didn't like that went on. All of that becomes an important factor in dealing with change. I mean, there's a letting go in life generally, a sense of dependency upon God, a sense that we can't control it all. And that setting aside, letting down, I think, becomes an important part. It goes along with the positive values that we talked about of having trust, that we would get from the Abraham story, in the sense that we're called by the Lord and to move forward, and that He'll always open doors for us. And in the process, I think there has to always be this letting go. We can cling to the past too much, and it can get in our way.
Okay. I was going to say, that's an awfully male thing for you to say, Jim.
Well, that's my perspective on
well,
it. You want to offer another perspective?
Yes, I do. I'd like to suggest that it's not as easy, I think, as your words "letting go" suggest. That suggests that I make an act of the will. I do let go of this. I release this person, perhaps whom I loved, who has died, and that's it. I go on with my life, or I just cut clear of the relationships in the last place where I worked or lived, and now I go on with my life. And I would suggest that's true in some minimal kind of way, but there is still the emotional residue of those relationships, of those past events, that I would just like to suggest doesn't drop into the archives of the past in our mind and get tucked back in some closet of oblivion as easily as you might suggest there. And this is perhaps one of the great problems in life, that we assent to the importance of doing something in our mind. Yes, I need to live for the now and into the future. But in fact, the reasonable thing to do is not always that easy to accomplish emotionally, and in fact, those bonds with the past are deep and not as much under our control as we might like to think.
Well, your point is well made. I'm not sure it is a male-female difference, however, but I think you are correct in saying that we take the past with us, that the relationships formed in our previous job or even in previous marriages, previous academic settings and so on, always remain part of us. I agree with that, and I think that's important. However, one still needs to take an attitude towards that. I mean, you can think of a destructive way of dealing with it, of always having a nostalgia for where you were before.
That's right.
Excuse me. And always thinking about the past and therefore not concentrating on the future. So, I mean, there's ways in which the past can be destructive, but I would not want to dispute at all your analysis of the web of relationships that we get involved in, and that we don't just break out from them or sever them completely. We always carry those memories with us. We're always, the friends we make, there ought to be an abiding character to that. You ought to have fidelity to the people you've met along the journey. I certainly agree with that. The question is, does that previous stage, that previous place where we're just totally call our time and energy and keep us from moving forward in a constructive way?
Okay, and I would concede that if that were the case, then our past could somehow disable us from living with energy and with enthusiasm now and into the future. Yes, I would agree.
So we get some agreement. Whether it's a male-female difference or not, I really don't know, but I would say that it certainly is typical in moral decision-making for women to be more attuned to the web of relationships. There's studies that suggest that, and if that's what you meant, I'd have to even concede that part of it. Thus,
especially since this program's almost over, you have to start conceding a lot. So you asked Jim earlier. So what do we need?
You better make this fast.
Okay, what do we need to bring then into changes? What are the virtues, to use the old-fashioned word, that are needed to make?
Let me just say
changes?
this. One thing: let's look at the changes as challenges instead of just dead ends for us or being downers.
Fine.
Let's see them as challenges. Let's see. Here's an opportunity for me to learn. Here's something to do something different, to break out of the rut, to get my imagination moving in a new direction. Here's a way to think bigger thoughts. I might be a more interesting person to be around. Let's think of them as great challenges, as opportunities to really grow and develop. You buy that?
I buy that. I buy that. And I would throw in courage or heart.
Important.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that also. We got a lot of agreement going here. Courage. So we got two things. But you're right. We have to say, what is the concrete way we end up dealing with this? New attitudes, so we see them as opportunities to grow and develop. And then the one you suggest is courage. That is, we have to have a certain fortitude in dealing with these things. Let's forge into the future. Let's not just coddle ourselves in a sense. Let's take it on with a certain resolute kind of character. Well, Pat, we've been talking about change, and it's a difficult topic. None of us avoids it. We all have to find our ways to deal with it in a better way. I like to believe the religious traditions help us to do that remembering the example of Abraham and of Jesus and even a Buddhist story might enable us to handle the changes that inevitably come our way.